If there's one thing I can say for sure about the Atari 8-bit computer line, is that they're filled with plenty of underrated games. Whether it's original classics or enhanced takes on games which came before, you'll be guaranteed you'll find plenty to enjoy. But from the many games in the library, there are some which are more underrated than others. Exciting, action-packed gems like the Dreadnaught Factor. This is Beyond the Scanlines, a series focusing on interesting games on classic computing and gaming platforms. A conversion of the Intellivision release from 1983, the Dreadnaught Factor has you taking charge of a fleet of Nova Ray hyperfighters with one simple goal: defend the galaxy from an invading force of invading dreadnoughts. Described in the manual as being so gargantuan they can dwarf entire stars, these dreadnoughts are not going to be a cakewalk to take down. It'll take a lot of skillful piloting to tackle them, as you must strafe their surface, locating the multitude of exhaust vents present, then drop a strontium bomb onto every single one of them. Only then will a dreadnaught's threat be ended with one gigantic kaboom. Sounds like a bit of a tough challenge, right? It only gets worse from here on in. These dreadnoughts are tough suckers, and they're filled to the brim with defences ranging from cannons both small and large, alongside drone launchers which will require swift control to evade. As you complete a strafing run over a dreadnought, it closes in on the Stargate in front of the Galactic Unstable Energy Field. If you fail to stop the dreadnought before it reaches the Stargate, then it's a galaxy-shattering kaboom. Thankfully though, you can impede its march of death. Alongside taking out the vents, you can also blast away its 4 engines. Each one taken down will reduce its speed, giving you that bit more time to take it out of commission. You can also bomb the Dreadnaught's missile silos. It sounds a little reductionary, but if you happen to take too long in stopping it, and the Dreadnought reaches the Stargate, if all the silos are taken out, it's going to be powerless to enact its galaxy-melting schemes. Finally, taking out the various bridges will reduce the firing rate of the defences, reducing the danger involved when you make subsequent passes. Now, this really makes an experience where you've got to have a slight element of tactical planning. Do you rush in, try to bomb as many vents as you can on a pass and dodge the defences? Or perhaps you might play it a little slow. Try to cripple the engines and the bridges to give you more time in order to surgically tear a dreadnought to shreds. It's not a design trick one sees in many games of this era, especially for games which originated on systems like the Intellivision. It really also makes for a heck of an initial setup, because you've got a choice of one of 7 difficulty levels. On the easiest, this lets you battle a single dreadnought. On the hardest, you get the ultimate terror, the You've Got to Be Kidding level, which pits you against a chain of 100 dreadnoughts. Now, this isn't all the difficulty levels offer. They also ramp up the intensity of the dreadnought defences. And yeah, I don't know about you, but I think I could see why they called that final level You've Got to Be Kidding now. Control-wise, this Atari computer version is controlled by your trusty 8-way digital joystick, which, compared to its siblings, makes things far more responsive than the disc of the Intellivision controller, let alone the analog control stick of the Atari 5200 monstrosity. Now, there is a downside, and you guessed it, it's the single fire button. Where both the Intellivision and Atari 5200 controllers have dual fire buttons, the poor 8-bit computers with their single fire button really complicate the independent firing of your laser bolts and strontium bombs. Bombs will be dropped on every 3rd press of the fire button, whilst lasers are fired on every other press. Now, is this really a pain? Probably not. Truth be told, at least with how I played it, I found myself just hammering the fire button regardless to blast those defences. So having them keyed to the same input is actually a bit beneficial. Now the inputs handle well, I didn't really find myself fighting them, and I dig the slight inertia you get when moving about. It really does add the feeling that you're battling something lumbering and gigantic, and it also adds to the tension especially on those later levels with their increased firing rates. On a visual front, it doesn't really stray too much from simple visuals of second generation console hardware. The sprites are simple, but they're well defined, and the extended colour palettes offered by the Atari hardware is used really well, especially with the destruction sequence, where you watch the Dreadnaught slowly fade to white as it's vaporized into a million little pieces. I absolutely love these aesthetics. There's something about this era of graphics which just screams video game to me, and I truly appreciate it. There's no fighting with clarity, it all scrolls smooth, and it's very, very colourful. On the sounds front, well, it's a game written for an Atari home computer using the Pokey sound chip, and just like the visuals, that also screams video game in the best way possible. Whilst there's no attempt at music being made here, the sound effects fill the void greatly, with engine rumbles, laser blasts, bombs being dropped, and the explosions. Oh, so many explosions. It's the kind of audio you expect in that wonderful pre-crash era, and it well and truly does the trick. It's got to be said, the Dreadnaught Factor is a game which doesn't really deserve to have been released on so few platforms. Placing the emphasis on bombing targets over blasting enemies adds quite a bit to the mechanics which were introduced by games like Xevious, and actually was probably the first case they were brought into the home, because it's quite a few years ahead of Xevious's own home adaptations. Whilst it carries the short-term arcade focus which many of its peers offered at the time, its pick-up-and-play mechanics, straightforward controls, and challenging action make it a game you could certainly sit down and get seriously engaged with. Sadly though, if you want to go down the physical route, the Atari 8-bit version is actually the hardest of the three versions to track down, and that's a bit of a downer. But that of course depends if you're really interested in collecting it or just playing it. And thus we come to the end of another Beyond the Scanlines. As always, if you enjoyed this episode, do consider hitting the thumbs up and letting me know what you thought. Hopefully it's convinced you to go check it out and see something a little less common and a little underappreciated by the wider retro space. As always, thank you all very much for watching, and I will see you on the next episode. I've always had a bit of a soft spot for Dreadnaught Factor, and I'm so glad I finally got around to covering it. It's one that I really wish would get a bit more attention, and I guess really being that the only micro it appeared on was the Atari machines, well, I could see why it doesn't get that. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the episode.